Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Value Podcast. And today I have Professor Markus Vinzent with us. Markus, thank you for seeing me in person. This has been a long time coming. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, for me to see you in person after 2 years of conversation via screens, I think it's a great experience.
Yeah, it was about time.
Yeah.
And if any of you I've seen him before, you know what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about all things Marcion. That's definitely going to happen.
Having said that, I'm not doing exclusively Marcion.
Right.
But here, we're fine on Marcion.
Exactly. Yeah. The last couple of years, we've been talking a lot about Marcion, the synoptic problem. And really, I just wanted to ask, what I want to ask you now is, I know that some of your views have changed on not only just Marcion's Gospel, but also Marcion's collection of Paul. And I want to dive into that more in depth with you. First, let's start off with your views, your new view on Marcion's collection of Paul, because now you believe there's an earlier collection. You've stated this before, so it's kind of a recap for those that have missed that. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, pleasure. Maybe just a sentence on the background. Why have those changed views?
Yeah.
It's just the result of quite a number of years of work, which has come to, not to an end, but to a fruition, because I was able, over the last months, to finalize the production of 3 volumes, which are going to appear in 2025. With, first of all, in a German version with Nach Franke, and we will have a discussion tonight, or rather tomorrow night, with another publisher, so that we might also publish it then in English for the audience here. So these are the reconstruction of the 10-letter collection of Pauline letters. The 10-letter collection is the collection that at least is in our historical witnesses are credited to Marcion of Synoptic. So this author from around the middle of the 2nd century. And whether or not he has put them together is a question we might raise a bit later in the discussion. But at least the witnesses that we have from the early 3rd century, which is Tertullian, but also Epiphanius then in the 4th century, these people think that Marcion put together a New Testament under the title of the New Testament. It's the first collection that has attracted that title, or been given that title, according to our witnesses. And within this New Testament, we have one Gospel, we have 10 letters of Paul, and a preface which introduces the New Testament. Interestingly enough, nobody so far has put together in a critical edition the Greek text of these 10 letters of Paul. We might also have a discussion a bit later why that was the case. But interestingly, in the 19th century, people started by putting together the deviation of these 10 letters of Paul in comparison to the same 10 letters in the canonical edition. And they only gave us, when the witnesses were telling us that in the Marcionite collection of these 10 letters, the text was different from the canonical text. And that resulted in lists of deviations. And I think that's one of the reasons why people had not, or had never really engaged with the content of these letters. They were at best engaging themselves in research, looking at the discrepancies between those few verses which were given and the canonical text. So up until Jason Bedouin put together his book a few years ago on the first New Testament, which is the collection of the Marcionite New Testament, for the first time we were given a running text, not only of the Gospel, but also a running text of these 10 letters of Paul. And for the first time, I think people were able to access not just fragments, but letters. But Jason Bedouin put together this book in English text. So he did not provide for the readers a Greek text. I just had a meeting with him prior to coming to this session with you, Jakob, in the convention hall. And he told me that over the last few months, he has worked with my colleague and friend Mark Bilby on putting together the Greek text that is underlying his English translation. And he told me it wasn't an easy task, but Mark was prodding him. And so I think you will have a release of the Greek text as he suggested the text to be for the letters of Paul. He also said to me, but he will talk about his own reconstruction potentially in another interview with Jakob here on this channel. He told me that the difference, of course, was when he was putting this reconstruction of the Pauline letters together, he, at the time, did not have access to the approach which I was able to tap into, and I will come to that maybe also later in the discussion today. So there are steps, as always, in scholarship. There are steps. We are all building on each other. So I was building on the 19th century lists, of course. I was working on the lists that were produced by Adolf Harnack, for example, in the beginning of the 20th century, but also on the old lists of Hilgenfeld in the middle of the 19th century, Theodor Zahn a bit later in the 19th century, than Harnack. And of course, we have Ulrich Schmidt, who also put together a refined list of these older lists. And the beauty, of course, was that I had Jason Bedouin's book with his English translation and reconstruction of these 10 letters. And I told him this afternoon in my conversation with him that it's nice also to see him in reality. I mean, we have had a few meetings before, but it's always good to see and talk to each other. And I said to him, you are one of my closest companions because you are on my desk and there is no day when I'm not conversing with you. So intimate is the relation between scholars. And the adaptedness. I mean, we are not one-man shows, right? Which shows why we're coming together at a conference like this one here in SBL with a few thousand colleagues and gathering in various circles to discuss our work. And it was a nice experience yesterday to sitting in the Synoptic Gospels session and Matthias Klinghardt and my book, Resetting the Origins of Early Christianity, coming up on screen and people were discussing it. So I think none of us want to make a case to say, oh, well, I'm the sole person who has insights into what we're discussing today. But it's a joint effort where at best as we can, we put our grey cells together. So to come back to the 10 letter collection, what we're discussing today is the fruit of this reconstruction, which I've put together. It will come out in 2 volumes of the reconstructed texts in comparison with the canonical text of these 10 letters. And in addition, I'm providing a big introductory volume, which is focusing more or almost exclusively on the textual evidence, on the manuscript evidence, and on the comparison between the 2 verses or versions of Paul. In an additional volume, which is being published separately, and this will be published first in German as well, with the publisher Herder, also next year, will be a content-related discussion of that reconstruction, which I think will interest us more for the readers and listeners to the channel than the technicalities, right? And that's also why I've put it aside and will publish it in a separate publishing house, which is less technically oriented, but more, let's say, for the lay people and for the public and for the interested people, and of course for colleagues as well, but more in a style which is accessible also for non-specialists. And in this volume, I'm taking the readers in a short summary of what it is technically, but more importantly, I then go through topics like economics, like what the two different poles have to say about money, about positions in the community, about the development of early Christianity. Then I'm looking particularly into the network of these people. So what's the network like that is addressed in at present in the 10-letter collection, and how is it in the canonical 14 letters of Paul? I then move into a section where I discuss particularly interesting theological topics: God, Christ, salvation, the future, predestination, and so forth. And I also have a section on the position of women. And the last part of this book will be a close-to-close comparison between the letters, giving the different structures of these letters and seeing how, according to my view, the earlier collection, which is the 10-letter collection, is being remodeled into a 14-letter collection by the canonical redaction. And I have to say the redactions, because as it turns out, these letters seem to have been redacted twice by canonical redactors, but we might discuss that a bit later. To end with the question Jacobite asked me is, where do I differ now after having done the reconstruction from the views I had held before? And I've always said the views which I have put out in books before are conditioned on further progress in research. And I think it's a fantastic element of research that A, one makes mistakes, B, that one corrects mistakes which one has made earlier. In the past, I had thought, from the evidence I was reading at the time, I had thought that Marcion was making use of potentially individual letters. It early dawned to me that three of these 10 letters, namely the so-called Deuteropaulines because scholarship worldwide, I think, regards, at least the majority of scholars regard those three letters, which is Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and the letter to the Laodiceans, the letter we know as the letter to the Ephesians, are separate and different from the rest of the Pauline letters, from the 10 Pauline letters. So from the so-called 7 letters of Paul, the most famous ones, of course, Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon. And the discovery was particularly that Marcion did not make use just of that one collection of 3 letters and then was collecting individual letters, which I believed before. But in looking into the text and in the reconstruction, it turns out that in Galatians, we have a very interesting back reference. In chapter 5:21, Paul is saying, the flesh is not inheriting the kingdom of heaven, as I have said before. Now, Galatians in this collection is the first letter. So how can he refer back to a letter, what he said before? And interestingly, this reference is a reference. So it's not just a random saying, because the precise reference goes to 1 Corinthians 15:50. And there we read the same sentence again, that the flesh is not inheriting the kingdom of heaven. And that results, necessarily results in having reference to another collection, which must have been an earlier collection, where 1 Corinthians stood prior to Galatians, so that the reference works. And it is then most likely that this collection, which is being used by Marcion, had the same order as we have it in the canonical collection. Because in the canonical collection, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians is placed before Galatians. And even before 1 Corinthians, we have Romans. in the canonical collection. So my guess is, I mean, this is the security, I think, is that 1 Corinthians was before Galatians in the collection Marcion uses. But then it is likely, I would say, that the entire collection that he uses had the same structure as the canonical collection. Because David Tropisch has shown in studying thousands of letter collections of antiquity that the reordering of collections is rather rare. The usual thing is that you expand the collection. Very rarely you shrink a collection. So it's usually the expansion of a collection. But it's not, or very rarely, that people take the effort of reordering. So then there needs to be a serious reason for a redactor to go into trouble and to reshuffle letters. Yeah, that's where I think one of my new insights is that Marcion is not making use only of 1 collection, but he is making use of 2 collections, of a 3-letter collection, the Deuteropaulines, and of a collection of 7 letters. And this collection of 7 letters had not the same text, but had the same order as the canonical collection. And from this insight into the profile, how a collector works, it makes a lot of sense to also correct another of my views, namely with regards to the gospel. Until I had this discovery with Paul and his collection, I had believed that Marcion, from oral traditions, put together as an author the Gospel of Marcion. And in a paper not long ago, where John Kloppenburg was in the audience, I spoke publicly and apologized to John, because John had a hard time with me the last 10 years, when I disputed that Q or Mark was around before Marcion, because I give you also the reason for it. Because prior to Marcion, we don't have any evidence whatsoever of any of these Gospels, let alone of a sayings Gospel. Because when we look into everything we have, we come back to Paul. Paul is the only one who sometimes says, well, the Lord says A and B and C. But then what the Lord says in Paul, and even what he's saying according to 1 Clement or in other texts, never occur in one of our Gospels, at least not in the same wording. So that was one of the reasons why I held against John that I wouldn't believe in Q and I wouldn't believe in Mark unless I gained some evidence. Now that I was the one to discover the evidence is the beauty of scholarship, right? And so I said to John in the paper, I apologize for what I've said in the last 10 years. I have to correct myself. That's the best thing one can do as a scholar, to come up with a better solution. And the solution is, if a redactor makes use, like in the Pauline case, makes use of 2 collections and of nothing else, then it is most likely that the same redactor, in working with another set of texts, namely the Gospel, is as pragmatic as with Paul, and is not going around the Mediterranean Sea and fishing for material. So he was most likely, which is a hypothesis, of course, yeah, but it is more likely that he was fishing rather for collections than fishing for individual material. And for that reason, I think there is a good case for having, let's say, a source like Q or pre-Luke or pre-Mark or whatever was existing before Marcion put together his collection. Which in a way is not cynical, but in a way is a beauty of scholarship, that the Marcionite work now is the first firm evidence for New Testament scholarship, the very first external evidence, with a bit of a reasoning behind it, but But through the profiling of the redactor, Marcion, for the first time, scholarship is giving a terminus undequem of, let's say, the likelihood that we have earlier collections. So far, Q was a chimera. It was a pure fiction of scholarship made out of Matthew and Luke. But that could have been a circular argument. Yeah, you have two collections with parallel texts. They could, as Mark Goodacre once said, could be directly dependent on each other and not relying on an earlier source. And not having any evidence prior to Marcion, yeah, that could have been written, yeah, whenever. But now, at least, we know that by the year, let's say 138, 140, we have evidence of two earlier collections of letters, and most likely have reason to believe now, with a bit more grounding, that also prior to the Gospel of Marcion, he might have made use of one or two sources for the Gospel. So there's suddenly a reasonable space for these types of earlier Gospel material, or rather Gospel collections. Yeah, and I'm not only proud of having made that detour, because without that detour, I think New Testament scholarship would not have at least that kind of a reasonable firming and grounding for that theory which existed before. So in a way, sometimes you have to do detours to come up with a better grounding of what people always believed. As I say, I mean, this is a debate which we can, in my eyes, which we have to have, which we did have before, which we will have in the future. So I think, I'm happy to engage with that in future research. But over the past years now, I have to focus on Paul, which is a complex topic. But I'm glad that I came up with a solution for which now there is a better conversation possible with New Testament scholarship.
And on the Paul thing, I was actually, just yesterday, I interviewed Nina Livesey.
Nice.
We were talking about...
new book.
Yep.
Very exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, and she also, very similar to yourself, but she's not sure if there was any real evidence of Paul actually writing letters.
Which we don't,
right?
Which I agree with her.
Right. That's why I said similar. Yeah. And to that end, Marcus, I want to ask you: do you think anything that Paul actually wrote slipped in, or we can't even be so sure about that?
I think that's the next step we have to discuss. Which I think it's always a pain, right, for people who listen into us. But our research is slow. It's a lot of detail. It takes a lot of time, and we are never at the end of the ladder. So here I would say we first, and that's why I also wrote this book about retrospection. We have to move backwards. Yeah. There's no point in making suggestions, jumping to a conclusion before we have the evidence.
Right.
Yeah. So we need to work in steps. The steps are forward going, but in reality, we have to go backwards. So the first, as you said, the first evidence, I think, which we have is Marcion's collection. Because the canonical collection we don't have. We only have it towards the end of the 2nd century. Yeah, with Irenaeus is the first one who knows about the pastorals, who makes a case for Hebrews, and very similarly, he makes a case for Acts. And only a contemporary of his, Dionysius of Corinth, same time, is the first to know about Acts. So we have to move backwards, right? And if Marcion's collection of the New Testament, and including the 10 letters of Paul, is our earliest evidence, now we can ask, is there anything before? And indeed, I think there are 2 collections of letters before. I'm just writing this passage for the book to be published with Herder, whether we can extract out of these two letter collections, the deuteropaulines and the 7 Pauline letters, whether we can extract ideas that seem to be older. And so what is the nature of these two collections? Let alone the question whether, if we have these two collections prior to Marcion, whether we can refer those two, or one of them, or some material in them, back to a historical person of Paul. That's even another jump, right? So the first thing is to determine whether we can move from Marcion's text to the content of those two collections he makes use of. In the case of order of texts, I've already made the case that the order of these older collections seem to be at least the one of the 7 letters seems to be the order of the canonical texts because of the back reference. So let's move from what we know. In the case of the 3 letters, what we can say is that both in the canonical version of the New Testament and in Marcion's New Testament, the 3 letters have different orders. In the canonical one, most interestingly, the 3 letters are not stuck together, because in between these deuteropaulines, you always find one Pauline letter from the 7 letters, which is interesting. By the way, it is one of the hymns which gives us reasons to believe that the 10-letter collection of Marcion is older than the 14-letter collection of the canonical texts. Why? If Marcion had reworked the 14-letter collection, he would have extracted out of the 14 letters 3 letters which did not stand together and grouped them together. And by chance, because otherwise it wouldn't have worked, by chance, fit 3 letters together which were part of a letter collection. Impossible historically. Yeah?
Yeah,
So
I agree.
it's much easier that from a letter collection with 3 letters, the canonical redactors have put in between always one canonical letter to make those 3 letters more part of a Pauline text. Yeah? The canonical collection does the same thing as Marcion, because it then bolts on to its collection 4 letters in a block, or at least 3 letters in a block, just as Marcion did, namely the pastorals. And then sticks another 2 letters of Paul, of the 7 letters, yeah, after them. And then Hebrews is somehow added. Yeah? So you see, the redactors have a very similar approach. When you find a complex of 3 letters, you put them together and just bolt it on your existing collection. But in the case of the 3 letters, of the 10 letters of Marcion, the 3 letters have been distributed, yeah, which is quite interesting. So when we now move from order to the question you have asked me, do we find also textual evidence? The first way to distinguish between what is Marcionite and what might have been older is not by the idea of distracting or dissecting what people make us believe is typically Marcion and what is not typically Marcion. The first way I'm approaching this question is by looking at internal discrepancies. And do we find texts where Marcion grappled with and where we have inconsistencies between one text and another text? And one of the perfect inconsistencies you can already see, for example, in the question of the position of women. There is only one section in the 10 letters of Marcion where there is talk about women should be subjugated to men, and which runs contrary to his collection of the 7 letters of Paul, because the only place where that is being spoken about is in the letter to the Laodiceans or Ephesians. There he has got that one section which says women should be subjugated to men. And I guess he has taken on board these 3 Deuteropauline letters by revising them to some extent, but as we can see from this section, his revisions cannot be so thorough that he left this passage, which he found in his text, without removing it, against his spirit and against what the 7 letters of Paul say. So here we have got one section where I would say this goes back further, and so we have a passage which shows that in the 3-letter collection, this must have been prior to Marcion finding it.
So it's in his letter to the Laodiceans over Van, and as opposed to 1 Corinthians. But does his collection have a similar verse in 1 Corinthians, or is it not there?
No.
Okay.
That's the interesting thing. And we can see that the canonical redactors add this idea that women should be subjected to men into the letter to the Colossians, which apparently didn't have it at the time when Marcion made use of it, because otherwise he would have left it just as he left it in the Laodicean letter. But there isn't that passage. So the canonical redactors, apparently, first of all, it shows that the 3 Deuteropauline letters are mentally and theologically, and I noticed that already when I did the reconstruction, language-wise, is closer to the canonical redacted texts than the 7 letters. And this is such an interesting observation that I put in the headline of my chapter, that what we do today in New Testament scholarship on Paul, we are making use of the text that is most apart from an earlier Paul. So all our Pauline scholarship, everything I'm hearing here for hours, is based on the text that is remotest from Paul that we can get. So that's the first observation. And it has to do, for example, that's just one example, that the subjugation of women is the furthest Paul would have said. Even if we don't think about a historical Paul, I'm just talking about the Paul of the earliest version that we can attain to.
Right.
Yeah? Because in the 7 letters that are given us by Marcion, there is not a single word. On the contrary, Paul, in that 7-letter collection of Marcion, makes it one case that he says, I can show you from the law that the law says women should be subjugated to men and that men should teach them. And this is an example of the Marcionite Paul, which shows that the law is no longer valid. And yet, when it comes to Laodiceans, he accepts that Laodiceans says women should be subjugated to men. This shows me the respect he has for the collections. So, your question again, I think it shows that the 7 letters of Paul that he has might go back to an earlier text and might be a reflection of Paul. But the 3 letters are a clear reflection of canonical Paul and of what the canonical redaction then is doing with not only the 3 letters, because they introduce this idea of the subjugation into Colossians, and they introduce the subjugation of women into the 7 letters of Paul. And that's what we teach in the churches today, and about what we have to hear in the convention on the SBL.
So what you're saying is the Deutero-Pauline letters in Marcion's collection is very much like the canonical text.
Precisely.
And so with that being said, are we seeing there the beginning of the canonical collection?
Precisely. And on this beginning, then the canonical redaction adds even more. For example, when you then take the pastoral letters, then you have the full subjugation of women. And not only to men, but now to the ordered men. So people who have positions like bishops,
right,
deacons, and so forth, right? So the removal of women becomes more and more the case.
It's like they're developing like an anti-woman ideology, and it's being built over more and more so as the decades passed.
Precisely. Yeah.
So as you said earlier, it might be a reflection of Paul when you talked about like the pre-Marcionite collection.
Yeah.
That's hinted at in Marcion's collection. But even then, as stated by the qualification might be, that we're still not sure.
It's too early days. I mean, first of all, I'm putting out for the first time a critical edition of these texts. Then it will need scholarship to work on and to see these inconsistencies.
Right.
Yeah. Then we need to see where, for example, are the commentators and the texts themselves, right? And I have isolated already a few instances within the 7 letters as well, where I think the redactor had great difficulties, yeah, and we can see that Marcion, despite being cautious, I don't think he has revised these texts exorbitantly, yeah. But there are passages where the text doesn't make a lot of sense, where you can see ruptures between the attempt of a redactor to make somehow sense. Most curious, I think, is, for example, another passage, always to do with women, sorry. But it's the big question whether a couple that is married still should have intercourse. And from the comments and the commentating Tertullian, it becomes clear that this text must have been very different from the canonical redaction. The canonical redaction, of course, says, well, you should better be in the state that I am in, Paul, so unmarried. Yeah? But then, because of the nature of human beings, you better marry unless so that you don't have intercourse extramarital, which is somehow a giveaway, yeah. So you give allowance at least for sexuality in marriage. But the Marcionite text reads that no, you are allowed to marry, but you are only allowed to marry or to come as a married couple into a Christian community, yeah, if you stop having intercourse with your wife. And you can see from the text that I'm not sure whether that is a Pauline teaching or whether that is a deliberate revision done by Paul, because the text as we have it is not fully sticking up. And but this is early days. I mean, I'm just indicating where we would need to look into more depth, make also comparison then with language and with other ideas to see how far we can get from the collection of Marcion further back into the 2 collections, and then probably even further back into Paul, if there is Paul. Yeah.
I think what you've shown here is this is a quest for the historical Paul.
Yeah.
Just like there's a quest for the historical Jesus.
Precisely. The quest is there.
Yeah.
The answer is not there yet.
Right.
We might come full circle, as with the other ideas I had, right? We might come full circle and at the end of the days, say, well, what we always knew about Paul is what we would know, yeah. But we have to take it in steps, yeah. And we might come up with another view that we say, no, it doesn't make sense, yeah. There was no historical Paul, which I don't believe is correct, because how would we have 7 letters with some consistency? But from the letters as we have them at the moment in the Marcionite collection, this Paul, if he were a historical Paul, would have held a lot of Marcionite views. And we will need to see whether that really pans out towards a historical Paul of that sort. We'll see. Early days. Things to come, you will see. More channel sessions we will have.
Absolutely.
As scholarship progresses.
When you look at the Marcionite edition of Paul and you try to peer into the pre-Marcionite edition, how is Paul portrayed as using the term gospel in those editions?
That is a very interesting question, because I was just in a session yesterday where I was told what Paul was saying, but all that Paul was supposed to be saying was a canonical Paul, right?
There we go, yeah.
Interestingly, in the Marcionite Paul, he talks about the gospel, yeah? 1 Corinthians 15 and in other places, 1 Corinthians 7, interesting places. However, he never, ever, in this Marcionite collection, makes reference that he has taken on board an earlier tradition. This is canonical. And hence, one wonders what he means by this gospel. It's not just preaching. Again, this is more canonical one, yeah? But when I take that text as we have it, it refers, I think, which also is most natural, because these letters are bound together in Marcion's New Testament with a gospel. So when Paul is making a reference to the gospel I am preaching, the reader of this New Testament will not associate with anything else but the gospel which is next door in the same collection. And another experience yesterday was Simon Gathercole's book on Gospel and Gospels was discussed. And Simon Gathercole, a fantastic scholar in New Testament, no doubt, yeah, and also very knowledgeable about the apocryphal literature, translating that he has done on these apocryphal texts. And in this book, if I'm not misrepresenting him, he tries to show that the reason why we have the 4 Gospels in our canonical New Testament is because these 4 Gospels have derived from an apostolic character, an apostolic belief system, with 4 elements. And those 4 elements he finds in 1 Corinthians 15. So it's to do particularly with the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ. And then he says most of these elements are missing in those apocryphal texts. Hence, those 4 Gospels were created just like Paul's letters on the basis of this kind of apostolic character. I was listening to it, I was listening to the discussion, and at the end I stood up and said, I'm impressed. I'm impressed by the book. But I think you have seen something which you haven't seen. Now, what did I refer to? Well, his view that these 4 Gospels matching Paul and therefore deriving from an apostolic character is a way one can see it, but as we don't have an apostolic character, it's an hypothesis. More likely, I said to him, what you have said is what David Trobisch was saying all the way, namely the coherence between Paul and the Gospels, and I'm now talking about the canonical Paul and the canonical Gospels. The coherence shows the redactional profile of the canonical collection. So the people who have put together the four Gospels and Paul redacted the four Gospels and Paul, and no surprise that they are coherent, at least to some extent. So it's not an apostolic character behind it, out of which they derived. No, it's the canonical redaction which made them fitting together. And my argument why I believe so is because exactly the same book I could write that Simon has written on the Marcionite level. Because the Marcionite Paul matches to a lot of extents and even to details, matches the gospel, the one gospel, and the one gospel matches the Marcionite Paul. Now this is intriguing because that speaks a bit against just the representation of older sources, either in Marcion's collection or in the canonical texts. So they don't derive just and fall into place. You couldn't have, if you say, well, he didn't do anything to the texts. It could not be possible that Paul wrote letters that fitted, let's say, Q, or that fitted a kind of pre-gospel, which then came together in Marcion's gospel. So we cannot discount entirely a redactional element.
Right.
Yeah? And because, I'll give you one example. In none of the texts, neither in the Gospel of Marcion, nor in the 10 letters, is there any word about the forgiveness of sin.
Wow.
To that extent that in the Lord's Prayer, that element is missing. How can that miss or be missing in the Lord's Prayer?
Right.
If it is missing in all places in Paul's letters?
That's incredible.
It doesn't work without redaction. Yeah?
Yeah.
And in the same way, now I could say like Simon, oh well, because that is missing, it derives from the apostolic character, which I think is nonsense. Can only be part of a redaction. And this is just one example. Many, many other examples we could show. Yeah. So there is a redaction behind these texts. I give you maybe one more example. Yeah.
Yeah.
In Luke 16:16, we have that everything could pass away, but not the iota, not a single element of the Lord's words. What is Luke saying? This is in Marcion.
Right.
So what is Luke saying? Everything can fall away, but not a single word of the law. Now, if we know that in the Marcionite Paul, the criticism of the law is so heavy that the law is not the condition for Paul. It is only Christ. And I guess we can see a match between the text of the Gospel and the Pauline texts. And the reversal of that idea that it is not the law which is losing the iota, which is of course nonsense, because in Luke, in other places, in the other Gospels, there is a lot of talk about that the law is no longer valid in all its iotas. On the contrary, yeah, Paul is saying, no, we are not bound to the law because it's not chiseled in stone like Moses did. So for us, a lot of these laws have gone. And the only thing that does not go away is the word of the Lord. And so we have a coherence, again, between the Gospel and Paul on the Marcionite level, and we have a coherence on the canonical level between the canonical Gospels and the canonical Paul. Because in Romans, it starts right away, Romans 1st chapter, 1-3, that Christ derives from David and from the prophets, and that the law is such an important element. Romans 9-11, and. So it really, Simon's book was a revelation yesterday, but with a different twist. I think a different form of explanation. I think his observation is correct. His interpretation, I would take a different stance.
So basically what you're saying is he found evidence of redaction but didn't realize it.
Precisely. That's why I was stating you saw something without seeing it.
That's right.
Yeah.
So basically, Paul's letters have experienced enormous multi-level redaction, similar to that what we see with the Gospels.
Indeed. And I think we can go as far as even delineating the steps of these reductions. So what I think becomes clear is that Marcion's reduction, as we have just seen, is not the first step. He presupposes at least one more step, potentially two more steps, because he relies on collections of letters. Those collectors, as all collectors, will have had an impact on the text. So that Marcion is not the first reductional stage. There is a reductional stage on the basis that he makes use of two collections. So we have those two collections, which are prior to Marcion, which is a reductional stage. Now we can ask, was it Paul himself who put those 7 letters together? Then that would be the first Pauline reductional stage.
Right.
But it might be, because David was saying that most collections go back to the author themselves, the first collection of letters. Then we would have the first collection stage of reduction, which could be Paul himself. If it wasn't Paul, then we have one more.
Right.
At least one more. Yeah. So after Marcion, and that's also interesting, after Marcion, the next reductional stage is not yet the 14-letter collection stage. Why I'm saying that? When we look through our authors and sources from the 2nd century, we can take any of these sources, be it Ignatius's letters, be it Clement, first Clement, we can take Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, and more. Scholars have run through all these texts, or Justin Martyr, for example, yeah, and have collected the potential parallels. Interestingly, very few, if somebody at all, makes reference explicitly to Paul. So it's mostly internal parallels. But there are some clear parallels, I think, nobody would dispute, or only very few people would dispute. And in collecting all of these evidence, we can see that the people who read and know of Paul do not refer to Marcion's text of Paul, only occasionally. But the majority of these people from the 2nd century refer already to a form of the 10 letters that is more closely related to our canonical Paul. And that means, but they don't refer to 14 letters, only to those 10. Which means that in a third stage, if you like, yeah, in a third reductional stage after Marcion, the first after Marcion, including the earlier two, we are now having the third stage, is a canonizing or canonically reducting of the 10 letters prior to adding the 4 letters. And this must have taken place shortly after Marcion had put out his 10-letter collection. Because we have people like Justin and others before, let's say, or around the mid-2nd century that make use of this extended collection already. And my view is that this first reduction of these 10 letters took place around the same time when the one gospel was also reducted into 4 gospels. which I would place around 145, 40, maybe 150. At that stage, we have 10 letters, but 10 letters which are yet not bound together with the four Gospels. So it's a stage of a first redactional, canonical redaction. But those 10 letters were the 10 letters the people knew in the 2nd century. Now we can also delineate from what the people quote and what they never quote. And interestingly, they never quote from Romans 15 and 16, which are missing in Marcion. So apparently the first canonical redaction of these 10 letters had not yet added the 2 chapters to Romans. Chapter 13, 1 to 7, that one should obey to the government, is never quoted in the 2nd century prior to Irenaeus. So apparently that section, these 7 verses in chapter 13 of Romans, was also not redacted in the first step of the canonical redaction. Another section which is very important is the collection for Jerusalem. Nobody in the 2nd century refers to that, which means that 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, which comes back in Romans 15, was also not part of the redaction. These are sections which apparently were only redacted when, around the time of Irenaeus, Acts became part of the New Testament, and in Acts the collection for Jerusalem plays an important role. Chapters 15 and 16 of Romans were added, where also the collection plays a role, and 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 was added at that time, which shows a closer relation between Paul and Jerusalem. So we can, with a bit more detective work, but that's early days again, I only indicate that as a future research trajectory. We might be able to delineate more closely what kind of sections have been redacted and added in the first redaction and what has been added around the time of Irenaeus.
What do you make of the book of Acts not mentioning Paul's letters at all? Because that's something I've been very curious about for a long time. The Acts of the Apostles does not mention Paul's letters. And scholars like Bart, Ehrman, and others will say Acts is independent of Paul's letters, doesn't know them. That's why it doesn't talk about them, and that's why it conflicts with them. What do you make of that?
No, I have a different view, because I think Acts was added to the New Testament at a time when these already redacted 10 letters of Paul were redacted again, and 4 new letters were, at least 3, the pastoral letters, and a bit later Hebrews, were added to the Pauline letter collection. Acts, I think, is cautioning a bit from reading the letters of Paul without Acts. It shifts the focus from Paul as a letter writer to Paul as a preacher and a missionary. And I think this is important. If Acts had made direct reference to the letters, that would have endorsed those letters as they are. And probably not just as they are in the canonical redaction, because we need to know that when Acts was added in order to refine the picture of Paul, these other letters were still around. Tertullian knows Marcion's collection. And the earliest commentator that we have is not a commentary of canonical Paul. Tertullian gives us the very first comments and a full commentary of Pauline letters, but of the Marcionite Paul. So I think when we have Acts, the canonical redactors certainly didn't want to endorse all Pauline letters, but wanted to shift the emphasis on Paul as a missionary. And the canonical redaction does the same. The canonical redaction introduces, as you will see when you see the parallel texts, Paul is no longer a discursive, almost philosophical-like teacher. He becomes a preacher. He becomes the missionary preacher as we have it indicated in Acts. And in this way, the canonical redaction changes and alters the texts. Paul becomes a big network player where not all, but many, many people who are mentioned in Acts coming along in his missionary work, Prisca and Avila and a number of other people, right? They suddenly now also appear in canonical texts. In Acts, for example, yeah. But they also appear in Romans 15:16. So now they become incorporated into Paul. So that Paul becomes not linked by Acts quoting those letters, but by binding them together, for example, through names or through the action Jerusalem collection, through a number of things where they have in common. Galatians 2, Acts 15. So it's more a building of a parallel world which becomes integrated. And the integration is by the readers, because those two texts segments are part of the same collection. What is more important, I think, is, as we can see from the later codices, Acts is always bound together with the so-called Catholic letters. Which means Acts was not understood as a separate text. Acts was understood as the introduction to a set of letters. It is the introduction of the three main people in Acts: Peter, James, and John, and Paul, eventually. And this, in the same way, the two of the five codices that we have from the 4th and 5th century places first the Gospels, then comes Acts, by the way, unrelated to Luke. They're only related to the prefaces. So we have the 4 Gospels, then we have Acts, then we have the Catholic letters, which start with James, Peter, and John. And as the last letter collection, we have the 14 letters of Paul. So in total, you can see Acts is not ignoring letters. Acts is the preface for the big letter collection, which consists first out of the 3 most important apostles, the columns of Jerusalem. And then we have the letters of Paul, which are now, let's say, not marginal, but they are prefaced by Acts and by the real apostles. And so Acts integration is an isagogical one, which we would say, so it's an introductory one. And in this way, I think it gives weight to the apostle letters, which we call the Catholic letters first, then comes Paul's letters, and then comes Revelation. Yeah.
What is the earliest external reference to Paul that we know about?
It's a bit difficult because we have great difficulties in dating some of the letters or some of the material in the 2nd century. And that's why it's one of the reasons why I work with Marcion, because that we can date. Because we know these teachers only came to Rome after the Bar Kokhba War ended, which is 135. That's why we have a firm date. That Clement of Alexandria tells us that they are the very first Christian teachers to move to Rome makes me skeptical from a different perspective that a letter like First Clement dates from the end of the 1st century. Let alone that in the meantime, scholarship has shifted, and we know that there's no reason that this letter should be from the 1st century. Yeah, we have no persecution which is mentioned in this letter, and.
So it's much later.
I guess it's much later.
Yeah.
So it is not by accident, I think, that Marcion might even be the first one that we have. Yeah. And so I would say he is our first source for the first quotes of Paul. And then it's a proliferation. Then we have Ignatian letters, then we have Polycarp, then we have God knows what.
And would that be an issue for the Epistle to the Romans then? Because if Clement of Alexandria is right, and there were no teachers in Rome.
Precisely.
The Epistle to the Romans goes out the window.
Yeah. And that's also why we have manuscript evidence that Romans ended with the end of chapter 14. Chapters 15 and 16 are unthinkable without Acts and seem to go back to the same time. And that's why in some of the manuscripts, Origen knows of manuscripts of Romans, without chapters 15 and 16. And the bilinguals that we have, which are 5 manuscripts from Paul, they indicate that they know of Romans ending at the end of 14. We have capitular chapters, which give us, which are older lists of chapters which were placed either behind or in front of our manuscripts. And they show that Romans ended with chapter 14.
So in that case, was the original epistle to the Romans showing that Paul was, well, obviously he was writing, if he did write something like that, he was writing from somewhere else, he was in Rome. But there were no teachers in Rome, he was writing to other people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting that these bilinguals, know of this letter to the Romans, not being addressed to the Romans, but being addressed to the people of love.
So it's not even originally to Rome in the first place?
Not necessarily.
Okay, so my question is that it goes out the window was right. Okay.
Yeah. We have the Marcionite preface that tells us that this is a letter to the Romans, So Marcion is teaching in Rome, So he might have had an interest that this is a letter to Rome.
That might be good evidence to that,
Of course,
yeah.
But the letter itself doesn't say so.
That's true.
Yeah. So I think we have to rethink a lot of things,
Yeah, it makes me wonder if Marcion just put the title there, even though it wasn't really about that. Which kind of reminds me of Laodiceans becoming Ephesians.
Which is the same thing.
Yeah.
In the letter to the Laodiceans, it doesn't say it's to the Laodiceans, It addresses the people without city.
Yeah.
But of course, for him, who is in Asia Minor, it makes a lot of sense that these letters go to places he knows.
That's a good point. It really distinguishes those letters from letters like Galatians, which inside its own letter, it does mention them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. Huh?
It definitely is. Well, thank you for joining me today, Markus.
Pleasure.
Vinzent.
You see, we have a lot more to talk about in the future. And with scholarship progressing, I think there will be enough stuff for food for thought.
I'll have the link to the Jack Bull's Patristico channel in the description below and in the pinned comment, and also to Markus Vinzent's books on the Amazon affiliate links in the description below and in the pinned comment. Thanks again, Markus.
Thank you so much.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.